Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be looking at the top 10 best wide receivers returning for the 2025 UFL season. Now, it might feel like yesterday, but it was over 2 weeks ago I did the top 10 best returning quarterbacks for the 2025 UFL season, and I figured that it would be a good time to look at the wide receiver position. Now, a big reason why I want to do this position specifically is because unlike pretty much every other position, this one has the most amount of high-end talent returning. To put it simply, this was a very difficult list to make. Once you got past kind of the top 6 guys, the more obvious players, it became this really tight battle where basically the 7 spot is relatively close to like the 15 spot. There's at least 5 receivers that easily could have made this list, pending on your argument. And because that I had to add in a few other things, instead of just looking at basic stats and certain teammates, I also looked at PFF grades, which is something I'm not usually the biggest fan of, but in this case I felt like it was necessary, as that kind of was the tiebreaker for a lot of these really tight battles, whether it be between like the 3 and 4 receiver or the 10 and 11 receiver. So this is a very tough one. So without further ado, let's get started with number 10, Javonte Payton. Again, this is where it starts off really tough because this 9 and 10 spot especially could have gone to legitimately probably like 7 guys. And that's not even counting the fact that some great receivers didn't return. If they returned, would have probably been on this spot as well. But I'm giving it to Payton. Now, while he was not a top 10 PFF receiver, one of the only couple of guys that didn't make it, the thing that put him over the edge for a lot of other guys is the 5 touchdowns. Look, this past season, we had about 7 players that had 4 or more receiving touchdowns. That's it. So if you had more than 4, especially if you had 5, that meant that you were a touchdown guy. And now, another thing for Payton is that his yards per reception was very high. He was 4th in all the qualified receivers at that 16.5. So yes, he may not have had a ton of receptions, but he was one of those deeper type of threats. And he was somebody that when he caught the ball, that was it. His yak was very low and is one of, if not the lowest in the entire list, which usually is something I'm not a huge fan of. But in this case, I feel like it's justified because of the fact that he was somebody who was getting those touchdowns, getting 5 touchdowns. I mean, come on. Almost a fourth of his catches were touchdowns. And just over 20%. You know what I mean? Like, he was a touchdown guy. So yeah, he's not going to have the most amount of yak overall because of the fact that almost a fourth of his catches were touchdowns. But overall, I feel like when you look at him right, the Renegades receiving core was a very, very dominant unit this past season. When you include Sal Cannell at tight end, it was an insane unit. And obviously, he's not the only Renegade to make this list. But in terms of who was going to be the next Renegade to put on here, I decided to put Payton on here because of the fact that he's such a touchdown guy. Because when you look at it, receiving touchdowns is a stat that some people are not a huge fan of and some really are. And I only say that because some people view that, like Julio Jones for a couple of years had that like touchdown drought and all that in the NFL. And you always have a receiver here or there that has an issue like that. But overall, touchdowns are still a big deal. It means that either A, you're being a deep threat that's getting that touchdown by beating the corners and safeties, or B, you're out physicaling somebody, or you're just outsmarting them in the end zone. And you got to reward that. So number 10, I gave Javonte Payton because of the fact that he had those 5 touchdowns. And I mean, he still came close with 400 receiving yards. He was 13th in receiving yards total. So he was still up there in the yardage total. Because of that, giving it to number 10, Javonte Payton. Now, number 9, I'm giving it to Marlon Williams of the Birmingham Stallions. The Stallions receiver was a tough one to put because there were a couple guys vying for that lower top 10 spot, but I gave it to Marlon Williams. The main thing for him is the fact that while he wasn't spectacular at any one stat, he was really, really good at all of them. Again, one of those guys that had 4 or more touchdowns, so you got to give him credit there. That's tied for 6 in receiving TDs. Now, he wasn't super high in a lot of other stats. He was just top 20 in things like yak, yards per reception, and receiving yards. But the postseason, he ended up finishing with the 2nd most receiving yards, tied for 3rd in receptions, and 5th in yards per reception. So when the playoffs came, he was a better player. And because of that, as well as the fact that he was really good, not great, but really good at multiple other stats, I ended up putting him on here. Now, he was also a top 10 PFF receiver. He was not one of the highest PFF graded receivers, but he was one of them. So that's kind of the thing with him. He had a lot of things going for him. Was he a top 10 receiver in yards? No, but he was top 20. He was top 20 in yak, top 20 in yards per reception. Was top 6 or 7 in TDs being tied 6, so he does have that benefit. And in the playoffs between the Stallions and the Brahmas, the two teams that played 2 games, he was one of the 2 best receivers statistically. So because of that, I ended up feeling like Marlon Williams deserved this 9 spot. Again, there's a few other guys you could argue, and like I said, the 9 and 10 spot were insanely difficult for me to pick guys to get those spots, because the spots above them were just, there was at least one really big argument to put them at the 7 and 8 spot, but 9 and 10 was a much more difficult one, and I felt like Marlon Williams deserved it and deserved to be the highest ranking Stallion receiver. Number 8 is going to be Siaosi Mariner. If you know PFF grades, you know why he's at this spot, and that's because he was the highest graded PFF receiver. Now, of course, this is all returning receivers. He was number 1. He was like the only guy that scored above an 80. He had like an 82 point something. He deserves this spot because of that, as well as the fact that he was somebody that kind of came alive to the end of the season. Again, he only played in 7 games, so yes, his 16th in receiving yards isn't the best, but you have to think about what if he had 3 extra games, he would have hit over 400. And 12th in yards per reception, a very solid number. And in the postseason, he had the most yards of anyone who only played 1 game, so obviously that's between Battlehawks and Panthers receivers. So you got to give him credit there as being a postseason performer. Of course, you remember that Roughnecks game where he ripped off that would-be interception for a reception. And it's just the fact that once Sims ended up going down for a little bit, Mariner really stepped up, and he proved to be one of those really great receivers. He did have 2 receiving touchdowns, 1 away from hitting that tied for 8th spot. So again, if you envision what he would have had with 3 extra games, he would have had even better stats. And again, he was the highest graded PFF receiver. I just don't find that's justification to put him any higher though than 8. I feel like that once you look at the guys that are above him, they're all either better because they were the lead receiver of their team, they were one of the top guys, or just something else. But Mariner deserved to be on this list because of that, and so I put him at the number 8 spot. Now, number 7 is going to be Ty Scott of the DC Defenders. He ended up being the 4th highest graded PFF returning receiver, and he's one of the 2 really good receivers in DC between him and Kelvin Harmon. There was a bit of a fall-off after that. Yes, Chris Rowland was a highly graded PFF player, but he did a lot of returning stuff, and I don't think his stats justify top 10, because I'm not counting return stuff. But the point is, Harmon and Scott were the 2 best receivers on that Defenders team. Now, Harmon is not returning. Harmon did miss a couple games, and if he had him, he would have been the leading receiver on the team, but he missed those couple of games. Overall, though, Ty Scott had a really good end of the season as well. When you look at him, he's somebody that heading into this upcoming season, you're confident he can be a great wide receiver 1 for the Defenders. Now, he had over 400 receiving yards, so he was 11th. He was 3rd in yards after catch at 153. He was tied 8th in touchdowns with that magic 3 number that we're going to see a lot. And he was 14th in yards per reception. So he was overall up there in a lot of stats. The only stat he wasn't super high on was receptions, which, I mean, come on, if you're high in yards per reception, you're probably not going to be too high on receptions. But deserves the 7th spot. Again, DC was a team that was nowhere near as good as people had expected them to be before the Abram Smith injury. And Ty Scott was one of the few guys that kind of overperformed, or at least performed really well. And so you got to give him a lot of credit there. And he was a really solid player. And I think he deserves the 7th spot. I know some might argue he should be higher. I think the top 6 guys, at least to me, are pretty clear who they are. But 7 is definitely a very deserving spot for him. He had a great season last year. It's going to be very interesting to see what he does this upcoming season. But number 7, Ty Scott. Now, number 6 is going to be Dawood Davis of the Memphis Showboats. Yes, he was an all-UFL receiver. But if you've seen my video on that all-UFL team and videos since, you'll know I had a very big problem with the receivers that were chosen, as especially the receiver position felt like it was more so narrative-driven than anything else. Dawood Davis was not a top 10 PFF graded receiver, believe it or not. So that's already one thing. And now another thing is that Jay Adams had almost identical yards to him. So the yardage really isn't that big a deal. It's the fact that, though, that Jay Adams was worse in a lot of other stats like yak and TDs. But Vinny Papale was another guy that would have been a top 10 receiver had he been returning, which, as of recording this video, unless something happens between me recording this and it being uploaded the same day, that he has not returned, so you have Dawood Davis. Now, he was a 5-touchdown guy, so again, one of those high-end touchdown guys, which is why I had to put him on this list. He was 5th in yak. He was the best overall offensive player on a team that was very poor. But again, people forget that Vinny and Jay both were still really good receivers. Despite how pitiful the pass protection was and the overall QB play, the receivers still were really good on this team, the top-end receivers. Again, 7th in receiving yards, 6th in receptions. Really high in a lot of these stats, but I just feel like the 5 guys above him were either guys who deserved all UFL honors a bit more than him, or were just a slightly better player overall. But that's no disrespect to David Davis. Like I said, the top 6 guys were the top 6. It's a matter of where I was going to rank them, but for me, I put David Davis at 6. Not being a highly rated PFF receiver, not being a true top 5 receiver in terms of yardage, which again, once you get past the top 3, there's a huge drop off, which you'll see later. But again, give him a lot of credit for the touchdowns. I just feel like that there's kind of been this hype around him with the showboats, which isn't fully justified in the sense that he was not the only great receiver on this team. He was one of 3 great receivers. But he still was the best of the 3, so even if Vinny was re-signed, Vinny would have been probably 2 or 3 spots behind him, and Davis would have still been here. But number 6, he deserves this. He was a great receiver. I just don't think he was top 5. That's because number 5, I have Tyler Vaughns. He was one of only 4 receivers to have 500 yards. Now, yes, it was very close with Fifth. Fifth was 4 yards away, but he still was one of only 4 guys to have it. He was the best receiver in a loaded receiver room. We'll get to the Battlehawks later, but the Renegades overall were the best receiving room last season, and it really wasn't close with the amount of really good players. A guy like Deontay Burnett had a great season and didn't even make the list. Sal Cannella, of course, was an insane tight end. When you look at Tyler Vaughns, he actually was the 3rd highest graded PFF receiver this past season. And again, he was tied for 4th in receptions, and he had that magic 3 receiving TDs. Now, again, he didn't have a ton of yak. 82 was not one of the highest amounts. But he was somebody who was getting a lot of receptions and was playing for Luis Perez like a great receiver. He was a huge reason why that team was as good as they were. Again, the Renegades' offensive line, especially in the start of the season, wasn't viewed as the best in the league. And Vaughns is one of those guys that made it look better, because if you have a receiver that's able to get open quickly, he'll get those receptions to make the job easier for the quarterback. Again, across 10 games, that's averaging over 4 receptions per game. So that's 4 times he's getting those really, really nice routes run, and he's able to get Perez to just throw him the ball quickly and not have to deal with anything else. And so because of that, he deserves the spot. He was the best receiver on that Renegades team that had a lot of great receivers. He outplayed them overall while not having the most touchdowns, was something that was really, really good on them. Now, you could argue Cannella was better, but in terms of wide receivers, he was the best on that team, and he deserves to be a top 5 receiver. Highly rated PFF guy, one of the highest yardage totals, deserves the 5 spot. Now, number 4, I'm going with Marcus Sims. All UFL receiver. Again, there's 2 guys ahead of him that should have probably gotten that. The main reason was the narrative overall. Marcus Sims continued what he did in 2023, which is he basically guaranteed you 140-yard reception a game overall. I mean, he had a 76 long for a reason, and he had 206 yards after catch for a reason. That yards after catch was really high on the list, but the main thing was that his reception, or his yards per reception, was insane. Yards per reception was the best in the league at 18.5 guys that would qualify, and he was up there in a lot of other stats as well. Again, his yards after catch was insanely high, and his overall receiving yards was still really high as well, being one of the highest guys in the league. And so when you look at his stats overall, it's pretty difficult to argue that he should be really anywhere else on this list. But 4th, it's just a matter of the receiving yards and a couple other stats. I feel like 2 other guys, and you probably know who they are at this point, should have been all UFL over him. Now, I understand. If he had played 2 more games, he would have had that 500-yard total. And if he did have those 2 games, he probably would have been up to 3. But when you're judging what he did do, it's kind of hard. He was a deep threat receiver, but you have a couple guys above him that played with similar to weaker quarterbacks and still put up great stats that were even better than him and were higher graded in certain cases on PFF, as Marcus Sims was a top 10 guy, but I feel like number 4 is a very solid spot for him. So I'm going to give him the number 10 spot, Marcus Sims. Now, number 3 is going to be John Trey Kirkland. Kirkland was an incredible receiver this past season and was one of 3 receivers to have 600 yards, which means you can probably tell who the top 3 guys are. Look, I know not everybody says, oh, well, stats aren't everything. Look, when you have one guy that hit 504 in Tyler Vaughns, and then you have the next 3 highest guys above 600, there is a clear difference from those top 3 guys to everyone else. And again, he still had good touchdowns. He had 3 receiving touchdowns, tied 8th. He was top 6 in yak with that 214. So he was up there in that stat as well. Receptions, he was tied for number 1 in receptions. yet he still had a solid 10 plus yards per reception. So he wasn't just getting the super, super small yardage, he was getting decent ones overall. It's insanely difficult to put him anywhere else. Now, yes, this team had a really decent receiving core, and you had a great tight end, Cody Latimer. But Jontre Kirkland was the number one receiver. And while I'm not really counting, he had a couple of trick plays passing that were really solid as well, if I remember correctly. He was just a very well-rounded receiver and deserves to be this high. Now, the reason he's not higher is because his stats aren't as good as a guy above him, and his quarterbacks weren't as bad as another receiver above him. But number 3 is a very deserving spot for him. It's going to be pretty difficult to argue he should be anywhere else on this list, either higher or lower. Should have been all UFL player. Number 3, Jontre Kirkland. Number 2 is Hakeem Butler. The Offensive Player of the Year, all UFL player, gets the second spot. He was first in receiving yards at 652, again, one of 3 guys at 600 plus. He was tied fourth in receptions at 45. Second in YAC at 272, though he was a whopping 100 yards behind first place, and tied second in TDs at 5. This might be shocking to realize, but the Battlehawks receiving core statistically was actually not that great. He was the only guy that was a top 25 receiving yardage guy on the team, believe it or not. Darius Shepard came in second on the team at 240, which was like tied 25th technically. Yeah, that's crazy to think about, but it's true. Look, a lot of guys had their like game or two, Marcel Aitman, Ja'Cory Pearson, Darius Shepard, where they were really good, and then they just kind of didn't do anything the rest of the season, whether it be injuries, just not being targeted and all that. Hakeem Butler across the entire season was the best receiver on this team by a mile. Now again, overall the receiving core of the Renegades was better, but heading into the season, the Battlehawks reviewed as the best receiving core. And Hakeem Butler ended up being the best of that group by a wide margin. He was incredible this past season. But there's a reason he's not number 1. Main reason is the fact that A.J. McCarron was a much better quarterback than anyone the number 1 spot had, as well as the fact that there's one key stat, which you can probably guess what it is, that number 1 guy just dominated on. And overall, I said it during my top 10 players of the 2024 season, I put Hakeem Butler as the second best receiver in that video, and nobody had a problem with it because everybody pretty much agrees that the best receiver last year was Justin Hall of the Houston Roughnecks. 372 yards after catch was first by 100. Again, 100 more than Hakeem Butler. He only had 3 receiving touchdowns. I know some of you might have an issue with that. But again, Hakeem Butler was the top 10 PFF receiver. Justin Hall was the second highest graded PFF receiver. He was the second highest at 78. So he's like 4.7-ish behind Mariner, but was still up there. And when you're considering how many times he was being targeted, it's a pretty big deal, right? Now, when you look at him, its receiving core was not terrible. Kiki Chisholm was another top 25 receiver in yardage, if I remember right. He was on the lower end, but still there. ARW was a decent receiver. It's not like he was the only receiver on this team. Again, if you're going to say Hakeem Butler, or you're going to say one of them was the only receiver, then they both were. You know what I mean? So you can't use that argument. Justin Hall was on a team where his best quarterback was Nolan Henderson. And look, I'm a guy who's very high on Henderson, but A.J. McCarron was a better quarterback than him last year. Now, post-injury, different story, but would you rather have the pre-injury McCarron that played for half the season, or would you rather have like the 2.5 games you really got in Nolan Henderson? You know what I mean? So we played with weak quarterbacks overall and still put up dominant stats. He was on a team with a terrible offensive line, still put up dominant stats. He was tied with Kirkland for first in receptions. He was one of the 3 guys at 600 receiving yards. He was another 10-plus yards per reception guy. But the important thing is that yards after catch. The fact that over half of his yards were after the catch is a big deal. It shows that when he got the ball, he wasn't just getting tackled instantly. He was able to break tackles, was able to just keep going downfield, was able to get those deep shots. Yet he wasn't always getting touchdowns. There's a big difference if you see somebody that has a huge yak, like let's say he had 350 yak, and he had like 6 touchdowns, and he had a long of like 65, you can probably assume that a lot of those were just beating the man or blown coverage, and he was getting deep shots. When you see only 3 receiving touchdowns, he's not getting those super deep broken coverage to that kind of degree, so he's earning a lot of these yardage. Again, 56 receptions is a big deal. He was the best receiver this past season. The way I view it is, could you imagine if he had even like a good quarterback for the whole year? Like, could you imagine if he had A.J. McCarron the whole season? Or, God forbid, if he had Luis Perez as his quarterback last year? He would have had over 7, maybe even 800 yards. He had Reed Sinnett and Jarrett Garantano throwing him the football for over half the season and still put up 600 yards and still had 372 yards after catch. He was the best receiver this past season. If you were going to give wide receiver an offensive player of the year, it should have gone to him. And if the fact that he wasn't an all UFL player was blasphemy, it was just a matter of you wanted to put a showboat on there, so you gave it to David Davis. The fact that he had a lot of screen time on TV and stuff is why I gave it to Sims. Justin Hall was the best receiver this past season. He got robbed from that all UFL spot. Number 1, Justin Hall. Overall, though, that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. Let me know down below what your top 10 receivers are that are returning. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree? Are there any spots you would change? Again, there was a couple guys that were really close. Ja'Cour Pearson I wanted to put on the list because of the potential, because of the fact that he did play, with the injury last season. But it was just kind of hard to justify putting somebody who was so hyped up and only really had one solid game on here. Again, guys like Deion Kane were close to making the list. You could argue a couple other Renegades guys could have definitely been on here. It was a tough list to make, but I think it was a fun one. Again, we're getting closer and closer to the season starting. We're less than 30 days away, and we're coming up on just being I think we are 25 days away now. So make sure you subscribe with the bell turned on to be able to get notified any video that comes out. And as always, guys, have a great night.